All right, I'm going to talk about something that you don't maybe expect me to talk about this morning. I know that Christmas is coming up next week. But I'm going to take us back to the 11th of September 2001 really quickly. I'm not going to talk about it politically or anything else. I'm just going to talk about the fact that some terrorists flew a plane into a building. Those of you who are younger do not remember this. You weren't alive, I understand that. You probably have seen pictures. It wasn't long before another plane flew into the other really tall building standing right next to it. We don't know exactly how many people were in those buildings. On a typical day, it was 50,000 people in those two buildings. And all of them were trying to get out of the building. They were in a doomed place. They were in a place destined for destruction. They were in a place where the top was on fire, and they didn't know how long it was going to be, but at some point, everyone in that building was going to die, and they didn't know how long they had. And they were trying desperately to get out. Meanwhile, there was another group of people going the other direction. They were going towards the building. Firefighters, policemen, emergency medical techs, doctors, nurses, ambulances, going toward the destruction, going toward the building. We don't know the exact numbers. Nearly 3,000 people died that day. That means that there were 47,000-ish that didn't die. Because they were organized and moved and treated and facilitated out of the building to go home. Because someone went toward the disaster to save them. These people who went toward the building had accepted a role, an identity, a way that they saw themselves. An identity that day wasn't interested in the politics about why someone flew the plane into the building. They weren't interested in who was it that designed these stupid buildings anyway that made it so hard for people to get out. They weren't thinking about any other factors. They weren't responsible for anything else except one thing: get people out of the building. That was their job, the job that they accepted. We're going to come back to that later. The students of the Word of God, we know that there's an event far greater than 9/11 in the future. An event of, for some, ultimate disaster, and for others, amazing hope and celebration and life and glory and victory. The debate over when this will happen has raged on for a long time, but many believe fervently that we are very near the end. I know several families that are considering life-changing decisions based on, at least in part, a serious conviction that the rapture is going to happen within 2 to 5 years. A serious conviction that things are going to happen very, very soon from now. Because of the seriousness of these choices, I feel it's my responsibility to make sure that we have a clear teaching on what the Bible says on these matters. To do that, I'm going to have to clarify a few things. I'm going to be running through a lot of scriptures more quickly than I am normally comfortable with. I'm going to use the screen to try to get through them. I do not like taking scriptures out of context, but I'm not going to have time to go through every single one. Please feel free to write down every single verse so that you can go back home and look them up. I do not like the idea of making people assume that I've taken everything in context. So the best I can do is encourage you to write these things down and go back and look them up yourself. The other thing I need to talk about real quick is how we view prophecy, because we're going to be looking at tons of prophecy today. There's a way that we can categorize different prophecy in a category that's been made as apocalyptic. Apocalyptic prophecy meaning prophecy about the apocalypse, prophecy about the end. One of the things that happens is that sometimes we decide that there's different rules for interpreting different prophecy. And so there's a significant group of people who've said that all apocalyptic prophecy should be taken very, very figuratively. We shouldn't at all try to make it make sense chronologically. We shouldn't pay attention to the dates or the amount of time. We shouldn't pay attention to the numbers. It's all just metaphorical. I just want to tell you that there's biblically very little justification for that. Let me explain to you why. The two areas of prophecy in the Bible that we've seen come true, most of them fall in one of two categories. They either fall in the category of when Israel was taken captive and returned. That's one category. And the other category is when Jesus came and was born on the earth. Okay? Now there's other stuff I could find, but most of the stuff in the Bible that has come true has been about one of those two events. And all of it has been written poetically, but has come true literally. All of it has come true literally. If we go back and look at the passages, there'll be one passage, and it'll have some about the captivity of Israel, some of it about the return of Christ, some of it about the end times, and there's no line, there's no thing in there that says, oh, we're changing the type of prophecy now, you should look at it differently. There's nothing like that, it just flows seamlessly. Which means, biblically, there is no reason to say that God did this literal, but he's not going to do this other stuff literal. That wouldn't be, that wouldn't flow. That wouldn't have any continuity. So, I'm running on the assumption that though some of these things are written poetically, they're going to come true literally. And that's a basic assumption I'm going to use throughout for everything we talk about this morning. Having said that, let's try to construct the events of the end. Construct the events of the end of the age as we know it. I'm going to suggest that the most central portion of that is what we would call the second coming of Christ. That's in Revelation 19, 11 through 16 up here. And I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat upon it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and wages war. And his eyes are a flame of fire, and upon his head are many diadems. And he has a name written upon him, which no one else knows except himself. And he is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. And from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may smite the nations. And he will rule them with a rod of iron. And he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God, the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I want you to notice for later, this army that's following him, and that they're in clothes of fine linen, white and clean. That's going to come up later. This describes Jesus Christ coming back bodily, not as a spirit, not Jesus went up as a flesh and blood human being. He is coming back as a flesh and blood human being. He is coming back to judge the world, end the chaos, set up peace, and establish a kingdom. That is the most important event left in history. This is the big event. The Old Testament prophets talked about this event. I somehow missed getting this into the slides, but it's pretty fresh in our minds because we just went through it in Micah 7, 11 through 17. This was just a couple weeks ago. It will be a day for building your walls, and on that day when your boundary be extended, it will be a day when they come to you from Assyria and the cities of Egypt, and from Egypt even to the Euphrates, even from sea to sea and mountain to mountain, and the earth will become desolate because of her inhabitants, on account of the fruit of their deeds. Shepherd thy people with thy scepter, the flock of thy possession, which dwells by itself in the in the midst of a fruitful field. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead as in the days of old. And in the days when you come out from the land of Egypt, I will show you miracles. Nations will see and be ashamed of all their might. They will put their hand on their mouths. Their ears will be deaf. They will lick the dust like a serpent, like reptiles of the earth. They will come trembling out of their fortresses to the Lord our God. They will come in dread, and they will be afraid before thee. That is one of the many descriptions from the Old Testament prophets of when Jesus comes in power as the Messiah and says, I'm in charge now, it is over, there's no more fighting, there's no more disagreeing, there's no more who's in charge anymore, I'm in charge, it's over, the nations are done, I'm king. There are many, many more. An event like this that I just read out of Micah has never happened since the days of Micah, but it will when Jesus comes back to rule. Another important one would be Daniel 7, 13 through 14. He kept looking up in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancients of Days and was presented before him. To him was given glory and the kingdom, that all the peoples and nations and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Son of Man is a title that Jesus used about himself repeatedly. I can give you countless examples. Jesus must at some point rule all the nations. Jesus himself spoke about this event in Luke 21, 34 and 36. We have that one? Maybe. There we go. Be on your guard that your hearts may not be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of life. And that day comes on you suddenly like a trap. What will come upon all those who dwell on the face of the earth. To keep alert at all times, praying in order that you may have the strength to escape all these things that are about to take place and stand before the Son of Man. I want you to notice a couple things there. I want you to notice that it's going to come on all that dwell on the earth. For it will come about upon all those who dwell on the face of the earth. So it's everybody. And then I want you to look at the term escape. Keep alert that you can escape these things. And we come back to this because Jesus' audience here is a specific audience. Escape what? What needs to be escaped? That the whole world is going to face something, and that there's escape that's going to be desired. This brings up a new topic about there's the event of Jesus coming back a second time, but before that, there's another period of time that's going to be a mess. There's a time before Jesus comes back that's going to be rough. It's going to be destructive. It's going to be bad. Revelation 8:13. We have that one. And I looked and I heard an angel flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, 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 to those who dwell on the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound. Here's what I want to say about that verse, 8:13. God is sending a message to the world saying, Woe is you, because I am going to do bad things, hard things, difficult things, destructive things. I, God, am going to bring wrath on the earth. That isn't something you want to hear. That isn't a message you want to be part of. God's wrath is going to be poured out on the entire world before Jesus comes back in power. I just read from Revelation 8. Jesus doesn't come back until chapter 19. So we're in chapter 8. Jesus comes back in chapter 19. That's 11 chapters of ick. From Revelation 4 to 19, there's 7 years of awful events that desolate the earth. And I want to help us visualize 2 halves of that 7 years. I don't want to make an overemphasis, but I do want to help us to visualize. The first 3.5 years are years of horrible turmoil in the earth, like earthquakes and famine and war and starvation and volcanoes and tsunamis and terrible, terrible earth events. The second 3.5 years is characterized more by horrific satanic political events. We see a completely unrepentant world by Revelation 9, 20 and 21, which is up here. A completely unrepentant world. And the rest of mankind that were not killed by these plagues. I'll get to exactly what that means in a second. Did not repent of the works of their hands, so as to not worship demons and the idols of gold and silver and of brass and of stone and of wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. And they did not repent of their sorceries, nor their immorality, nor their thefts. I want to tell you, by Revelation chapter 9, how many people are dead. Here's the number. First, if we have 100% of the world, right? The first thing that happens is 25% of the world is killed by that first 3.5 years of destruction. So that would leave how much of the world left? 75%. Then the plagues that are mentioned here kill another third. So if you took 75% and took a third of 75, what's that? 25, right? So if you take another 25 of that, what do we have left now? 50. By the time we get to Revelation 9, 20 to 21, half the population of the world is dead. Half are dead. It's a lot of dead. A big, big, big lot of dead. And yet we have a completely unrepentant world. And it is this unrepentant world, starting in verse 9, that accepts the beast, and we talk about now the image of the beast and the dragon and the number of the beast, and I'm not going to get into all that stuff in detail. I simply don't have time. But all of those things that we think about when we think about the end times, all of that stuff is after this. It's not before. It's after this. After this point is when we're talking about a world government, when we're talking about the number and all that stuff. That's all after this point. So as you're trying to visualize those 7 years of it, there are 7 years of just general earth mayhem. And then somewhere after, in the second 3.5 years, we reach a point where of complete worldwide earthly depravity, where Satan is in absolute control. Another thing that happens during this time frame, when Satan himself is cast out of heaven, he must live exclusively in the earth. I do not know whether that means he has to have a physical body or not. I don't know what that means. I do know that Satan's not in heaven anymore, and he's living on the planet. So when God says his wrath is going to descend on the earth, he isn't joking. All of this will happen before Jesus' big return to earth. And I could draw from all over the Bible to support the picture of this time, and we could go over it for weeks. Now, after Jesus comes back, it's going to be very, very, very different. Revelation 20 describes a time period. I'm talking about chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20 describes a time period of 1,000 years. A time of peace when Satan will be bound and Jesus will rule physically on the earth. In Revelation, this description is only 10 verses long. It is during this time that God will fulfill the promises he made to Israel. Promises about land, for instance. Let me show you Genesis 15:18. You can get that one up there. Maybe. Wonderful. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the river Euphrates. Okay, Everyone to visualize here. Can you see from back there? Hayden? Okay. And whenever we think about Israel, right? It's this. Here's Jerusalem. Here's as big as Israel has ever been. Right there. Okay. Here's the great river of Egypt, and here is the Euphrates. That's what God promised Abraham. That's never happened. That's never come close to happening. Never, ever, ever have the Israelites owned and controlled a chunk of land going all the way from Egypt through the entire Arabian desert, all the way to where Babylon and stuff is. Never! Does God keep his promises? So it's going to have to come true someday. It has to. How does it come true? Well, I'm not going to read them all, obviously, but you're going to read from Ezekiel chapter 40 to Ezekiel chapter 48. We have the longest description of the millennium in the entire Bible. 8 pretty long chapters of some fine detailed stuff that is really interesting. 8 full chapters of the millennium, Ezekiel 40 to 48. You know what happens in 48? Ezekiel sees a vision of the people of Israel assembled in that space. You can look at it, you can do the math. It says who's next to who and how much territory they own. And the people of Israel take up a chunk way bigger than they have ever owned. Ever. In physical history. And so he's describing the millennium, and in this millennium he shows Israel occupying that chunk. Part of the reason of the millennium is for God to meet all of the promises that he ever made to Israel that haven't happened yet. They're going to. And so we can see that. And so we're going to have this 1,000-year period of peace where God is going to do a lot of things, where he's going to show a lot of things, and where all of these things that we read in Micah about this eventual time of peace and prosperity does come true. Micah 4, I don't know if I actually put it up on there. Sorry about my voice. Micah 4, I'm just going to start with verse 2. And many nations will come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, that we may walk in his paths. From Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples, and render decisions for mighty distant nations. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up their sword against nation, and never again will they train for war. And each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Through all the peoples, though all peoples walk, each in the name of his God. As for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever. We have pictures of this millennial paradise scattered all the way through the Old Testament prophets. I can bring up dozens. So we have this picture. Jesus is going to come back in power to rule the world. Before that, there's going to be 7 years of absolute disaster. After that, it's going to come 1,000 years of amazing peace, where God keeps the rest of his promises to Israel, and where we rule with him. Jesus reigns over all. And one of the questions that we have to be left with in all of this is, what about the church? How do we fit into this? When we go to the Old Testament, I'm just going to be honest with you, the church, you might be able to squeeze some verses into talking about the church. It's really hard. The Old Testament isn't about the church. When we look at the Old Testament, what's in there, there's a lot about what God's going to do with Israel and how it's all going to come down. is not one of them. And even as we come to the New Testament, our prophecies about what will happen or what must happen in them, they all have to do with the second coming. As far as what comes first and then something that happened. That all refers to Jesus coming in power. There are things that have to happen before Jesus comes in power. We have not a lot to go on as far as anything else. But we do have a clear view, perhaps, of how the church fits from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 16 and 17, which I have preached on again during this last year. And we should have a slide for that. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first, and we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. So that's not really talking about the church. That's good. Is that the second coming? There are people who say that it is. What they say is, Jesus is going to come back, and when he comes back, the church will meet him up there. Okay. If all we had was that verse, maybe that would be a reasonable outcome. Right? Maybe that could be reasonable by itself. But we have some other verses that create some tension. 1 Thessalonians 5, 8, and 9. But since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. That's a really important phrase, that God has not destined us for wrath. Because if God's not destined us for wrath, and we're to have 7 years specifically devoted to God pouring his wrath out on the earth, maybe we're not supposed to be there. That would be nice. It would be beyond nice. It would certainly fit with the description that we're not supposed to be the recipients of God's wrath. Jesus took God's wrath for us on the cross. That's why we celebrate communion. We celebrate communion because Jesus went to the cross, and all the wrath that was due me went on him. We already saw from chapter 9 that we have of Revelation, we have a whole planet now of unrepentant people. How can the church still be on the planet if the entire planet is unrepentant? You see, we have a description of the population of the world, and the description of the population of the world in Revelation 9 is nobody repented. How could that be the church? If everyone on the earth has devoted themselves to idolatry, if everyone's devoted themselves to that, we have more things that we need to consider. Revelation 19, 7 through 9. Do we have that one? Revelation 19, there we go. Let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him. This is an event in Revelation before Jesus comes back. For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. And it was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, linens bright and clean. For the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. And he said to me, right, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. On the bottom there, I have a bunch of verses, I could have made more, that describe the church as the bride of Christ. Revelation 19, 7 through 9 is before Jesus returns. The big return, this is before that. And there's a marriage feast. Who is Christ marrying? The church. It has to be the church. How are we there? If we disappear at the second coming, how are we there for the marriage? We can't be. For us to be present for the marriage, we have to already be there. So, the concept is that this description of God, Jesus coming back for his people, happens at some point before his second coming. That's the reasonable conclusion. You remember when I talked about the army that was following Jesus in the second coming? Remember what they were wearing? And I said, remember that? Linen, clean, and white. Same description. The clothing that we receive at the wedding feast, we've still got it on when we follow Christ into battle to take the world. It's the same description. Clothed in fine linen, right and clean. For the fine linen is a righteous act of the sins. You can look at Jude 1, 14 through 15. Do you have that one? And about these things also Enoch, from the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of their ungodly deeds which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. So we have this picture, even that Enoch prophesied that the Lord would return with many thousands of his holy ones. That's us. So if we're going to say that there's an event when Jesus comes from the church and they leave, that's separate from the second coming, we call that other event the rapture. That's what we call it. And like I said before, defending the rapture is very, very possible, but defending the rapture takes a little bit of work. We have to dig around a little bit. Because there's no spot in the Bible where it says, there isn't one. There's going to be a rapture, and then there's going to be 7 years of really bad, and then Jesus is going to come back in power and in glory, and then there's going to be 1,000 years of peace. And there's no part of the Bible that gives you that timeline, that clearly. It's not there. We certainly don't have massive amounts of prophecy that tell us anything that would tell us when the rapture was going to happen. Any of the prophecies about signs are about the second coming, not the rapture. So when does the rapture happen? We can try to make some logical assumptions. First of all, it would make little sense for Jesus to rapture the church 100 years before the second coming. Why? Well, by that time there'd be a whole other church, right? I mean, we would have disappeared, and those people who were in the church that weren't actually Christians would go, oops. And they'd probably get right, and they would do something new, and they would make a new church, and we'd have a whole other church to deal with. So it doesn't make any sense for this rapture event to happen gobs of time before the second coming. That doesn't make any sense. The most popular opinions are either at the beginning of the 7 years, so the church experiences none of this wrathful time. And we've said it's a horrible, horrible time. There is a lesser explored opinion that rapture time is actually going to be at the 3.5-year point, that the first 3.5 years are more natural occurrence type wrath, and that God's specific wrath doesn't happen until the back end of the 3.5 years. They call themselves mid-trib or mid-tribulation raptures. Either way, either proposal takes the church off the earth before that eagle says in 8:13, woe, 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 on the earth, God's coming to judge. Both of those options take the church before that. Both of those options take the church off the earth before Satan is banished to the earth and everything goes truly nuts. So as we're trying to figure out, then, if the next real event for us as a church is the rapture, can we work out? Well, maybe. If you ask me, could the rapture have happened 500 years ago? And I'm going to say yes, it could. I'll explain why in a bit. If you ask me, could the rapture happen today? I'm going to say yes, it could happen right this second. And if you ask me, could it happen 200 years from now? I'm also going to say yes, it could. But having said those things, I'm going to have to defend myself. One of the things that we need to think about as we consider what we know about what will happen. We have a lot of information about what will happen before Jesus comes back that second time. When he comes back with an army, when he comes back to rule, when he comes, we have tons of information about what happens before that point. About what's going to happen with Satan, what's going to happen with government, what's going to happen with the world, what government's going to look like, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but here's going to be something I want us to think about. That first 3.5 years is going to change the planet so much that whatever we see now is irrelevant. We defend that. Imagine living on a planet that, first of all the Christians are gone. There are 619 million professing evangelical Christians on the earth. Evangelical means they have roughly the same definition of becoming a Christian as we do. Let's say, I'm going to be conservative, let's say half of those people aren't actually Christians, they're just going to church. There's only half of those people that are actually Christians. Let's just go with that number. Maybe you agree, maybe you think it's even less, I don't know. That's still 300 million people gone. Airline pilots while they're flying, doctors in the middle of surgery, bankers, teachers, lawyers, politicians, all kinds of people snap, they're gone. That's going to change things. It's going to change things if no other reason than all the Christians aren't here anymore. That's going to change things. That's 10 times the population of Australia. Gone. But now let's consider what happens to destroy half of the population of the earth. Meteors falling from the sky. Who knows how many satellites are left? Who knows if we have power left? We're talking about volcanoes and so much ash in the air that we can't get solar power. We're talking about earthquakes and tsunamis. We're talking about entire cities being swallowed by water. We're talking about plagues that kill billions of people. And we look back at COVID and go, well, remember the good old days? When 4% of the people might have died from the disease? No one in this room can describe the world that's going to be left after that. We can't, the entire countries will just be gone. Governments will be finished. The structure, I don't know if there'll be an internet left. I don't know if telephone service will be still working. All of that is really, really doubtful. We're talking about a world completely devastated and changed beyond any recognition. And what I'm telling you is, if that happens, we don't know what the world looks like after that. We just don't know. It's whatever it needs to be. That's so much devastation and change and confusion and destruction that it really doesn't matter what the world would look like before that point. Who cares? Because the world is destroyed. At the time we're talking about the government that Satan sets up in the world, there are no lasting vestiges of what started before. It is an apocalyptic, post-nuclear wasteland. That is the world that we see Satan step into and create his government. Just like any other book or movie or anything that you've ever seen about what the world looks like after a big disaster, that's what we're looking at after the end of the first 3.5 years. a complete restructuring of every government, not even totally different world after 3.5 years of God's wrath pouring down and absolutely devastating the landscape. So my argument would be, who is to say anything has to be in place here for the world to be exactly what it needs to be after 3.5 years of that? For everything to happen exactly the way the Bible says. My second concern about thinking about Jesus coming back or the rapture and what's going to happen and trying to predict it is the question, does God ever fail? And I realize it's a philosophical question. I would say no. God never fails. Do the schemes of God ever fail? Every prophecy that God has given must have not just truth, but also its desired effect. These are two different things. It's one thing for God to give us a prophecy and for that prophecy to come true. It's a different thing for that prophecy to have the desired effect God wanted it to have. I'm going to give you an example. We had tons of prophecies of the birth of Christ. Tons of them. None of them effectively allowed anyone to predict his birth. Nobody. Not one scholar correctly predicted his birth in advance. So I'm going to tell you something. It was not God's purpose for people to be able to predict his birth in advance. Otherwise, God failed in his purpose. Are you following me here? If God's purpose was for people to predict in advance when Jesus was born, and then no one did that, then it wasn't his purpose that happened. I can tell you a really, really good reason for what he did. Is that we would have proof that Jesus is exactly who he claims to be. Which we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of prophecies that do what? Prove Jesus' existence, prove his identity, and also prove that the Bible's true. Because now we can say, really, you doubt this? Because I can point to hundreds of prophecies before Jesus was born, and they all came true. God's purpose wasn't for anyone to be able to predict when it happened. His purpose was for people to recognize it when it did happen, and to give strength to the faith of Christians for 2,000 years. God's purpose was fulfilled. So is God's purpose for giving us prophecy about his second coming so that we can time it? If so, he has failed. Because we spent 2,000 years getting it wrong. At this point, I'm just going to break it out. If 2,000 years worth of people say, no, it's now, no, it's now, no, it's now, oh, no, it's now, no, it's now, oh, no, it's now, no, it's now, oh, no, it's now, and then somebody's right, they weren't clever, they were lucky. They just happened to be the last ones. When 2,000 years worth of people say it's coming now, somebody eventually gets to be right, whoever they are. Matthew 25:13 says, we will not know the day or the hour. So what is God's intention for these prophecies? Because his intention must work. And his intention must be true. And his intention must happen, because otherwise God's a failure, and God's not a failure. So what we should look at is, God gave these prophecies. What did he intend them to do? I'm going to tell you what he intended, because I'm going to tell you what happened. We have 2,000 people who lived urgently. We had 2,000 years of people who took it serious that Jesus might come back soon and lived their lives differently because they had the anticipation of Jesus coming. They weren't right. They just lived urgently. And God had every intention for the church to live on the edge of its seat. God can only get us to live the lives that we need to live if we are constantly living under the assumption Jesus is coming back right now. And that's exactly what he succeeded at. So if we are living under the assumption that Jesus is coming back right now, I applaud you. That is exactly how we should be living. We should be living that Jesus is going to come back next month or next year. We should be living as if Jesus is coming back in 2-3 years. I cannot prove to you that it will. But if that's the way you're living, I applaud you. That's exactly the way we should live. We should be living urgently, anticipating the return of Christ. And I believe that fervently because that's exactly what God has done by giving us these prophecies. It's to urge us to be watchful. It's to urge us to be attentive. It's to urge us to live on the edge of our seat. Not just the last generation, every generation needs to live on the edge of our seat. So if we are living fervently, prepared for the return of Jesus, and we believe that the rapture could come at any time, great. But that does lead to one last question. If we believe we should be living like Jesus is coming back now, what should that look like? Well, let me suggest, first of all, that it should not look like running away. There are passages that talk about escape that we already read. If you look closely, every single passage in the entire Bible about running away and hiding is directed at Jews. Why? Because Jews are not raptured. They're still here. And they have to survive that 7.5 years. And God provides a way for them to survive that 7.5 years. We can read about that in Revelation. I have there you go, 12:6. And the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place to be prepared by God so that she might be nourished for 1,260 days. Which turns out to be 3.5 years, by the way. And if you read that in context, we find out that the woman is symbolic of Israel. It talks about her giving birth to a son. That son is Christ. We read in Revelation that there is someone who must hide. They must run away. They must go to the mountains. They must hunker down in the cave. That is Israel. Why? Because Israel doesn't get raptured. They've got to survive the whole thing. And the only way they're going to survive is to hide. We find those hiding things in the Old Testament. We find it in the things that Jesus talked to when he was talking to Jewish people. And we find it in Revelation. We do not find anything written to the church that says we're supposed to hide. Consider going back to our illustration about the Twin Towers. I want you to imagine that every single emergency responder had a device on their belt that as soon as it was really going to be dangerous and the buildings were going to fall and it was all going to, that they would instantly be transported to safety. You imagining this? Like somehow Star Trek. How much bolder do you think they would be about rescuing people from that building? I mean, if you knew that the wrath wasn't for you, that the building was never going to fall on your head, that the fire was never coming back on you, you could go into that building fearlessly and rescue as many people as you could get your hands on, and you were going to, at the last minute, go and not be there anymore. That should start to inform the way we should be living. The church is the rescue team. The church is the only people with the message to get people saved from the wrath of God. We are it. We are the firefighters and the policemen and the emergency responders and the medics and the people in the ambulance. We should be running toward the fire. Our job isn't to survive. We're going to survive. Our job is to rescue. And just like those emergency responders sprinting towards the building didn't have a lot of time to worry about what Al-Qaeda was doing, and they didn't have a lot of time to worry about who made the buildings and why, and they didn't have a lot of time to think about who was in charge of the buildings. They had time to do one thing: go save people. That's what we've got time for. If we look at the early church, this is exactly the way they lived. Paul believed Jesus was coming back in his lifetime. What did he do? He started as many churches as he could across the world that he could reach. Philip shared the gospel. Peter traveled and taught. I could go on and on and on. The first generation of the church believed Jesus was coming back while they were still alive. What did they do? They didn't hide. They worked as hard as they could to save as many as they could. The world is on fire. It's going to collapse, and we don't know when. If we really believe that Jesus is returning in 2 to 3 years, let's say I fervently believe that. I don't have time for government protests. That government's going to be gone from the planet in years. There won't be an Australian government anymore. It won't be here. The atrocities or policies, there won't be one. It's gone. I'm not worried about international things. Why? If it's gone. I'm not worried about my rights. I'm not worried about my health. I'm not worried about anything, because if I really believe Jesus is coming back in 2 to 3 years, it's all gone anyway. Everything's gone. I should have one goal left. And it shouldn't be about my health. And it shouldn't be about being angry at the government. And it shouldn't be about trying to change law or policy. I should have one goal left. Save as many human beings as I possibly can. I don't know what those choices look like to you to have the biggest influence on the world that you can have. But that should be our decision-making matrix. Do I have a job that by staying in that job, I reach more people for Christ than if I didn't keep that job? That is a question we need to ask ourselves. Do I have other choices that I need to make, that I can make? Which is the one that leads me to the path of the greatest impact in the world? Because frankly, nothing else matters. I'm not trying to convince anyone that Jesus isn't coming back soon. If you believe he's coming back soon, hallelujah, that's exactly what we're supposed to do. All I'm asking is that we carefully consider what this should mean to our choices, and that we're logical about where we put our effort, and logical about where we put our attention. Because if the building's really coming down, all we can do is keep as many people out as we can. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, in a week we're going to celebrate your birth. In a week we're going to celebrate that you made the beginning of the most amazing plan. It would start with you becoming a human being, and living the life that we could never manage to live. And paying a price you never, ever, ever should have had to pay. If there was ever any being that did not deserve what happened to them, it was you. And you took the wrath. And when I look, Lord, at the wrath that you describe in Revelation, and I consider that Jesus bore that for me, I realize I don't have a clue what Jesus endured on the cross. I realize, Lord, that my perception of what Jesus endured on the cross is always too small. I simply don't know. All I can do is live in thankfulness that you took the penalty for me. And that way you will no longer look at me in a way that deserves punishment ever again. Lord, we are so thankful that your plan includes victory, incredible wonderful, permanent victory in which every single promise that you have ever made is fulfilled. Lord, there is devastation because your wrath is still upon those who have not accepted Jesus Christ's payment. And someday that wrath is going to come unfiltered to this planet. Lord, would you cause us to be overwhelmingly burdened with the job of rescuing those who are going to fall in that wrath. Would you help us to take every other concern and every other distraction and every other worry and just chuck it out the window and leave this alone? What do I do? How do I live my life to impact the most people I possibly can? What is that path? Because the whole world is celebrating Jesus' birth. And yet, so many of them are still in horrible, horrible danger. And many of them don't have a clue. Help us to be both victoriously hopeful and yet desperately eager